Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is session 2 of our virtual summer celebration, week 1 here at Spring Canyon, which was slotted to be homeschool week. By way of review, I'm Andy Truitt, the Director of Interns and Outdoor Leadership here at Spring Canyon, which is a ministry of Officers Christian Fellowship. And what an honor and privilege it is to be here serving our guests and families. And albeit in a very strange way this summer, we are still happy to serve, and I'm very, very happy to be here with Wesley Dickinson, who is our guest speaker for week 1, and we are talking about homeschooling. And so, I was going to say yesterday, but in our last recording, we talked about some questions that people have about homeschooling. We acknowledge that it's a very interesting time with COVID, pandemic. Many families who never in a million years thought they'd be homeschooling had the opportunity to homeschool.
Right.
And so many of them started asking questions. And so we've talked about things like why would you consider homeschooling in the first place? And who could be a homeschooling parent? And then if we did decide to do that, what would some of the options be? And what would be some of the things that we should consider? And so in this session, we're going to continue our conversation, and we're going to start off by considering ourselves and why we chose the path that we chose with regard to educating our children at home, and then specifically with the material, the curriculum, the methodology that we've used, and all of the things pertinent to our homeschool journey. So I'll turn it over to you, Wesley.
Awesome. So Andy and I are both homeschool dads and our wives, and we have selected Classical Conversations as our main curriculum and the community that we homeschool in with other Christian homeschool educators. And it's interesting because there's a lot of things that led my family down this path, and I'm sure that you and Heidi talked about, well, gosh, there's so many of these options. What is right for us? And our family, we ended up at Classical Christian Education, which is a very specific model for bringing up our children and making responsible, God-fearing, Jesus-loving adults out of them, right? Some of the reasons that we chose this, my wife and I, was it's an education of the whole person rather than just the academic intellect. We touched a little bit on this in our session number 1, talking about the academics, they work themselves out. But really the key for homeschooling is the virtue, the character that we're trying to instill in our children. Academics, I mean, is that your experience with your boys, that it's not without challenges, right, the academics, and there are days where you just have to sit down and you have to do math and you have to do your schoolwork. But the academics work themselves out. We want to educate the whole person and nurture their soul, right? We're not measuring them as objects like we talked about in session number 1. We are nurturing the souls of these individuals.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, which I find myself saying to you a lot. But it's true, because the real bottom line comes down to that character that is developed. Because one of the things that people have heard me say in the past, if they've heard me speak about education, or if they ask me questions, I have a very different criteria for what I consider to be successful education than most people, and certainly than the world. So this might sound strange to some people, but if my 3 sons say please and thank you to the waitress and mean it, and that's the key, right? We can say please and thank you out of protocol or out of a societal obligation. We can say please and thank you because we're civilized. Or we can say please and thank you because we mean it, because we recognize the value of the server, that person is a person created in the image of God, and that person is serving us, and we can be grateful and appreciative and mean it. And so, if my 3 sons, without any prompting from me and without any desire or pressure from desire to fulfill a societal obligation or feeling pressure from a societal obligation, if they say please and thank you to the waitress, then I feel like that's really all I could ask for.
Right.
And that is a successful education. And the academics take care of themselves.
Right. They don't learn that in a textbook.
Right.
That doesn't mean they can't learn that while they're using a textbook, right? Through the modeling of the parent, the teachers, but they don't learn it in a textbook. However, with the classical Christian model, the classical model itself, the way that it approaches the textbooks or the way that it approaches the academics is different than our modern system.
Absolutely.
Where the classical system really, rather than focusing on a survey, it focuses on mastery, right? We don't want our children to just have a survey and say, yep, I did it, check the box. I think I heard someone at some point say cram, pass, dump, which is how I got through school, right? I would cram for the test, I'd pass the test, and I'd dump it, and I got good at it, right? I got A's. I graduated with a 4.0, and I was told, hey, you are smart. But as I got into my adulthood, I realized there were a lot of things that I didn't know that I felt like I should know.
Right.
Because I didn't spend time mastering it during my education.
Right. And it's really interesting because in our last session, we talked about the fear that some parents have of having gaps in their academics because, I'm not the expert, or somebody else is better at that. And so many of us parents have that fear that there are going to be gaps. Well, Wesley just acknowledged a fact, speaking for himself, and I think we can all attest that having come into an adulthood, and I was very much the same as you, I learned how to play that cram, pass, dump game very well, all the way through high school and all the way through college. And there are some things I learned, but I really didn't learn much. There are so many things that I could have learned had I understood the difference between surveying material to check a box, right? Surveying material as an object to be measured versus mastering material that is true and good and beautiful.
Right. Now you have older boys than my younger girls, but I'm going to guess, knowing that you went through the classical conversations program, that all three of them, there was at least one class that they took more than once. They probably took it 3 or 4 years, right?
Absolutely.
And it was the same class. They just went deeper as they became more, as they were able to master the material. They were able to go deeper, right?
Right.
In my education, once you got credit, right? You got credit on your transcript for a class. The idea of taking the same class a second time would have been ridiculous, right? Even though I didn't have the material mastered.
Right.
I mean, I got an A.
Right.
Which said that I get credit for it.
That's right.
But I really love the classical Christian model where my students aren't going to come out just with a survey. They're going to come out with mastery, and they're going to understand and know what they know.
Right.
So hopefully when they get into their 30s, they won't be like I was thinking, wow, I feel like I'm a fairly educated adult, right? I mean, I've got a bachelor's and a master's degree in engineering, and I just, there's so many things that I feel like I should know that I don't or don't understand because my education wasn't classical. It didn't go to that mastery level.
Right. Right. I agree. I think looking back, for myself as well, one of the things that I would say that I am sad about, maybe there's a little bit of maybe it's jealousy. I don't know. I'm being a little bit transparent here. But having gone through this education process with my own children and with my wife, I mean, that's another thing as a couple being homeschool parents can be it's very, very challenging. Don't get me wrong. But it's like we mentioned in the last session, we have those tough days with our students, but then there's just these moments of praising God for the opportunity, and those far outnumber ultimately.
Oh, by far.
And are so much more profound. And you have those same kind of moments with your spouse when you're doing this. And so as Heidi and I have gone through this with our boys, I've looked back at my education, and I'm jealous of of how many things my boys have got to master. They've actually got to spend time. It's not just a survey. I thought I was getting patted on the back all the way across. You're smart, you're good, go, 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 go. Check the box, move on, cram past dump, cram past dump, cram past dump. And wow, I could have actually learned Latin, which would have helped me be able to communicate better in English. I could have spent more time studying physics, which is actually really interesting, the way God created the universe.
Oh, it's amazing. And high-level mathematics, just seeing how math is just this language of perfection, right, that God made. And I'm right there with you, where I don't think that I learned how to learn until my late 20s, early 30s, and it was on my own.
Right.
And these students that we're raising that are going to be smarter than us, if they're not already smarter than us, are learning to learn so early on that they have no limits. They can learn whatever they want.
Right. Right. And I'm seeing that in my own sons. I mean, I would constantly have to pretend like I know what words mean when I'm having conversations with my sons, and kind of get them to help me understand the context. Sometimes I just have to admit, hey, hold on, slow down. Bring it down for your dad. Help me understand what you're saying. And that's such a beautiful thing as well, though. I mean,
with a humble heart, right? Like we talked about last session. It would be so easy to just be prideful about that and say, and get frustrated with your children that are smarter than you, right? And not in all aspects, right? Because you have a lot more life experience. But man, are they impressive. And I don't say that just about your boys, but as I meet families in classical conversations or families that have used that classical Christian method or model, and you have high school students or even high school graduates, they're just these very, very impressive individuals. It's just, and I think it lends back, or it all follows back to that mastery versus a survey, right?
Right. They've mastered much subject matter, and they're able to have conversations on a wide variety of topics, intelligent conversations, and ask questions, and be humble. And that all goes back to that mastery.
Right. So you mentioned in the things that you could have learned if you would have started in the classical model was Latin being one of them.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people, when they look at the classical, or they hear the classical education model, they start thinking Greek and Latin all the time, right?
Right.
When it's not just an education model with Latin thrown in as a subject.
Right.
But there is an aspect of the classical model where there's a Latin word, and I think you know what I'm leading to here, that really describes what the classical model is, and that is the trivium. Right? And trivium in Latin, tri being three, like a tricycle or a triangle, and vium, or way, or road, right? So three roads. So there's really a three roads or a three path is trivium through the classical model. You want to move in, and we'll talk a little bit about what those three paths are, or those three different stages, and hit on those a little bit?
Absolutely. Briefly, before we touch on those, I want to acknowledge that classical education isn't necessarily Christian.
Oh, that's a very good point.
And we are advocating a classical Christian education,
Right.
and I think that's clear in what we've talked about: the soul to be nurtured versus the object to be measured. We want to develop the whole person, the character and virtue of our children, not just the academics, not just the head knowledge. Right? There's a sense in which this is more about wisdom than it is about intelligence or smartness, right? Or whatever adjective we want to use, because there's a difference between being wise
and having knowledge.
And having knowledge, right? Or being wise and being smart.
Yes.
Right? So we want to acknowledge that this classical education isn't necessarily Christian, but we want to focus on a classical Christian education, or Christian classical education.
Right. And similarly, not all Christian education is classical.
Right, exactly.
Both of those adjectives are used to modify the education piece, and they mean something very, very specific.
That's
We've got a Venn diagram where there's overlapping, and we're we're focusing on that in the middle, right?
Right, we are. And the reason that Wesley and I are discussing this is because this is the model method and actually the organization that we choose to help us educate our families at home with a Christian classical model of education. And so that's why we're talking about it. It has been beneficial for us. And the reason that Heidi and I decided to use a Christian classical education is because we felt like it made the most sense, actually. And that's when, as we get into what this trivium thing is, it just makes sense. I would go so far as to say it's the way, really, that God made us.
Right.
It's the way God made us to learn. And I would say that even the secular Darwinian evolutionists who study brain development and neurology would even acknowledge this. This is the way the brain works. So the trivium actually become the grammar, the dialectic, and rhetoric, and these are stages of learning in one sense, but more importantly, they're actually arts to be practiced for a lifetime.
Right, and that's what we talked about with wanting to model for our students. We talked about this in session 1. We want our students to become adults that can go and learn themselves, where they can take the initiative. And this trivium, this is the toolbox they need to take with them, right? This is the art of learning that they can use. So we talk about the grammar, and maybe what we could do is just really briefly touch on each one, and then we'll go back in on with more depth and describe each one. So the grammar, we've got a foundation that we're building, right? Where all this knowledge just comes in, and you don't necessarily understand associations, but you have this foundation that's built and it's solid. And then after you're solid with that grammar, you move up to this dialectic piece, or as you mentioned, sometimes referred to as logic piece. And that's where you find out how all this stuff fits together, right? And you start asking questions, or your students start asking questions about all this stuff that you put in their heads, that they put into their heads. How does it fit together at the dialectic stage? And then you come up to this rhetorical stage where they become poetic and expressive. Would that be a pretty good synopsis just of what those three different levels are?
Yeah, I think that was a very clear synopsis of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And to go a little bit deeper in with respect to how those are arts to be practiced for a lifetime, right? Anytime you or I want to learn something new, we have to start at that foundation. That's what you said. I like the way you did this. You know, this is the foundation. The grammar stage, the grammar level is the foundation, right? And that's all that knowledge, facts, vocabulary, not necessarily associations yet, right? But once we have a foundation, then we have something with which to associate.
Right.
We have something, we have things to think about. We have things to wonder why.
Right.
Things to wonder how, because we have all that knowledge. So we go from the foundation up to the dialectic, and we start to piece all those things together, and then we can express, we can do, right? So if I want to learn anything new, so if I want to pick up a new hobby, like fly fishing, let's say I want to pick up fly fishing, no matter how old I am or how young I am, I have to start at the grammar stage, if you will, and it's just the way it is. It's the way God made us learn. It's the way we learn things. So there's really nothing new under the sun in this classical model. Is the way that we learn. So to learn fly fishing, I've got to start at the grammar stage, appropriate a foundation of knowledge, and then I have to practice with it, right? I have to do it poorly. I have to associate all of that knowledge about what is a rod and a weighted rod and a line with a tippet. What's a tippet? See, I'm using all this vocabulary that people who aren't fly fishermen or women won't know what it is.
They don't have that grammar.
They don't have that grammar. They don't have the foundation. And then the flies, and you match the hatch, and And is it a wet fly or a dry fly? Well, it depends on the season.
Not a fly fisher. So this is all not in my grammar, right?
So you don't have it, right? So I would have to show that to you. Let's start there. Then I would take you down to the pond and let you practice, and you would not be very good at it. But G.K. Chesterton said, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. And that's very profound, because if it's worth doing, then do it.
Right.
And then, you know what? The first time you do it, you're not going to be very good at it. So you're doing it poorly. But by God's grace, you're going to get better. You're going to get better. You're going to get better. You're going to fail forward. Right? And this goes back to talking about the classical model, edifying the whole person. It's an education for the whole person. Learning how to fail forward is very, very important. And that's by appropriating some grammar and then trying to be dialectic with it.
Right.
And you're going to fail, and you're going to fail. But then at some point, it's going to click, and you're going to be able to do it. You're going to be able to execute or perform, and that's the rhetoric stage, right?
And it doesn't matter whether it's fly fishing or guitar playing or math or even
rocket science.
Rocket science, right? Anything. One of the best analogies that was ever kind of presented to me when I was shopping and looking at this whole menu of, gosh, what works best for our family, is imagine if you take your 4-year-old into the kitchen and you sit him there at the counter and you decide, I'm going to make an amazing chef out of this child. And you imagine that your pantry is empty, your refrigerator is empty, your spice cabinet, everything is just empty. So what you start doing is every day you're sliding a couple dozen items across the counter to them and telling them exactly what it is. You say, okay, this is an orange, this is turmeric, this is milk, and you're explaining all these ingredients. You don't explain necessarily at that grammar stage that we generally don't cook with green beans, chocolate syrup, and sprinkles. I mean, some kids may like that, but you don't explain how all of your ingredients fit together. You're just building that pantry, that grammar for that student. And you do that for years and years until that pantry is full, the refrigerator's full, and the spice cabinet is full. And then instead of sliding more ingredients across, instead you might slide a recipe across that says, get all of these ingredients together. So the student says, gosh, I know what these ingredients are. I've spent the last 3-4 years, however long it was, gaining this foundational knowledge. And they put it on the counter, and there's different techniques of cutting and preparation. But what happens if they're going through this recipe and they don't happen to have one of the ingredients? Well, then you pause the recipe and you either figure out where you can get it. Let's say they're cooking chicken noodle soup, right? They throw chicken in and stock and, okay, saute up some carrots, some green peppers, some celery, and they're putting all this into the soup, and all of a sudden it says, add 1 tablespoon of fresh parsley. And they say, what's parsley, right? You say, okay, well, pause your recipe, and what we're going to do is we're going to go to the store to get parsley, we're going to go out to the herb garden, we're going to go to the neighbors, and you're going to give them that grammar. This would be if you tried to start doing algebra without a mastery of multiplication. You need to pause algebra and go back to the grammar, right?
Right.
So you're going to slide these recipes to your student for the next number of years, and it's going to be breakfasts and lunches and ethnic dishes from around the world. And they're just going to gain this understanding of how ingredients fit together. So that one day as they become rhetorical, you, instead of sliding a recipe across to them, you say, you know, I'd like you to make me an Indian dish. So they think to themselves, Indian, okay, well, cows are sacred in India, so I'm not going to use beef as a protein, I'm going to grab chicken. And they can turn around and be poetic or expressive, right? Because they've had so much experience figuring out how things fit together that now they become rhetorical as a chef. And when I heard that, I said, wow, if only I could have my students do that in math and science and just guitar playing, you know, fixing motorcycles, you know, whatever it is. If they understood that this is the process, they could learn anything, right?
That's right. That's a really great analogy. Stock your pantry full, so then you have all the ingredients you need to complete the recipe, and then practice completing the recipe, right? Because not only may they not have parsley, right? It calls for a certain amount of parsley. Maybe they have parsley, but they put too much in it, right? Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Make the chicken noodle soup. Chicken noodle soup is good. Right? Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. So then they taste it, oh, there's too much parsley, or whatever the case may be, right? Hopefully everyone's understanding the analogy, but that's the dialectic, because then they're like, next time, not so much parsley, right? Until finally, every time they make a batch of chicken noodle soup, it's delicious, right? It's true, good, and beautiful. And this is what the classical model talks about: truth, good, and beauty. It's about discovering truth, good, and beauty. And by going through these stages of the trivium, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, right? And remember, we talked about having that Christian aspect of it. So ultimately, we have the privilege of discovering the truth and the good and the beautiful of God's creation.
We do.
And then rhetorically living that out day by day. And so, once again, the grammar is the basic fundamental building blocks, vocabulary, knowledge for any subject matter, right? We've talked about fly fishing, we've talked about cooking, we've talked about motorcycle repair, we've talked about math, science, right? What about literature?
Absolutely.
Right? One of the things that has been fantastic for me and my children is reading great literature together and having amazing conversations. And the grammar that we get, that we're building from having a base of literature that we've read together, to go on to another piece of literature to compare this story to that story, Shakespeare to Tolkien, right? All of those things make more sense of the world that we live in, or help us to make more sense of the world that we live in, that God created, right? And so, again, it's about the whole person, and it's not about subjects. It's not about I'm a math person or I'm an English person, right? Certainly some people have a proclivity to math and science as God created them. Others may be more inclined to literature and the arts as God created them, but we are all humans created in God's image, so we all can appreciate math and science, and we all can appreciate literature and art.
Right.
And a lot of that comes from understanding that grammar is essential for that appreciation, right? Let me say it this way. The more you know about something, the more you appreciate it, right?
That's profound.
So I remember my wife, when I met my wife in college, she was a downhill ski racer. Now, I had downhill skied before, and I thought I was pretty good, but she skis circles around me. And then I started learning a little bit about downhill ski racing. And so when I watched the Olympics the next time, I paid more attention. I enjoyed it more because I actually understood it more.
Right.
Right? And it's that way with everything. Grammar helps us to have knowledge about subject matter so that we may enjoy it, appreciate it, share it, be dialectic with it, right?
And that, not just the subject matter. As you build grammar, you see how it relates to other things. You had math on one hand and arts on the other. Well, what is music? Right? Music is math. It just happens to be in motion.
Right.
And that's what the classics look at it. So rather than teaching each of these subjects isolated, the classical model says, no. Everything's related. And then when we flip it over and we add the Christian perspective to that classical, you might have all of your subjects related, but God's in the center. And you can see, wow, when you study physics, like you said, physics is beautiful when you look at how perfectly God made the universe. Math is beautiful. Music is beautiful when it's paired with the mathematics of harmony. And it's just amazing how God has created all of this. And if we look at any subject matter through the lens of how good God is, we can go even deeper, right? Than just saying, oh yeah, that's neat, they're related. They are related, but having God just makes it more.
Yeah, and I think, one of the ways that I say that is everything's related because God created a universe, not a multiverse.
True.
Like it is a unified creation. And again, it's just the privilege that we have to discover it and learn about it. Learn who we are as creatures created in the image of God, learn who God is as the creator, and learn what does that mean and how should we be. And ultimately, that goes back to what we've been talking about. Why did we homeschool? Why do we value homeschooling so much? It's not so much about the academics, though those come. And again, I'll just attest, two kids in college who've got scholarships to college who are doing very, very well in college. The academics come, right? But it's that learning how, we ought to be. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we ought to do it.
True.
And this Christian classical approach really helps us to consider that question: how should we be? What should we do? And are we doing it?
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that comes ultimately in that expression, that rhetorical expression. And one thing that I want to say about, I want to go back to something I said about that I think this is just the way God made us learn. Mm-hmm. And so we've talked about that kind of as old men,
right.
Learning new things. Mm-hmm. And we've given some analogies, but I want to point out that the scientists, whether they be secular or Christian, right, when we look at brain development, we see that young children have a brain that the primary function of that brain in young children is to get input. It's to receive knowledge and input. It's how they learn to walk. It's how they learn to talk, right? They're getting input constantly from everything around them, and they're looking at their hand and figuring out that this is part of me, right? And then they learn how to talk, and then they learn how to how to walk, right? Because they're watching and they're learning. So young children have a brain that is primarily designed to receive input, right? And then there's a point at which it's different for every child, but there's a point at which that brain development switches, and now my primary function isn't to get information, it's to put all this information together and figure out how it works and answer questions like how and why.
So are you alluding to maybe teenagers that are arguing, right?
Right.
As they enter that dialectic stage.
Right. Maybe even preteens, right?
That's true. I know some personally that are entering that dialectic stage, and well, it's like you mentioned, I'm kind of taking it off track, but they can be dialectic in some things and still grammar in other, and be rhetorical. I think I've heard you talk about a 4-year-old can be rhetorical with Legos, right?
Yes.
Because they've spent the time with the grammar, with dialectic, figuring out how they fit together, and then they want to explain to you, right? Be poetic about it, what they're doing, right?
Right. Exactly. So it is, again, I think all of these are stories or analogies or metaphors that show this is the way God made us to learn. And a 4-year-old can be rhetoric with Legos, right? As a 49-year-old, if I want to learn anything new, I've got to start at the grammar, right? So it's not subject matter, it's not checking the box, right? It's about a unified, integrated creation and a mastery of various subject matters in order to become a whole person as God created you to be, as He created me to be, as He created our children to be.
Right, and that's to bring it all around to last session we talked about a lot of these different options that we can do. In this session we spent a lot of time focusing on what you chose, or you and Heidi chose for your family, what Mindy and I chose for my family. And I think that, at least I don't want to speak for you, and you can add to this, but one of the reasons we picked this classical Christian model is because we want to develop and nurture their souls of our children. We want to help them become the individuals, the souls that God wants them to be, that whole person. And the classical Christian model, and doing that in community with, we found by the grace of God, it was one of those knocking, the door will be open, where we knew that we wanted to do classical education. We didn't know how we were going to do it. We prayed, and neighbors moved in 2 doors down that were they were military PCS and in, and they happened to be doing classical conversations in Florida. And guess what? They jumped right into a community there in Omaha, and that's how we started our journey. It was prayerfully asking God, because we want our girls to be whole souls, right?
Right. Yeah, I don't think I'd have anything to add. Same kind of things happened for us a little bit longer ago.
Right.
But what a blessing and honor and privilege it is to educate our children at home, to be a present mommy and daddy, and then to have adult children now, and it's so much fun because your children are really just starting, and they're so sweet. They're just sweet little girls, and then my guys, are pretty much done. And we were having dinner last night, and we were all able to have conversation.
Yeah.
Right? It's just, what an amazing gift, what a blessing of God, how pleasing it is when brothers dwell together in unity.
You got it.
Psalm 133.
Amen.
And really that takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of purpose and intentionality. It takes being present and attentive. And home education is one way that we can be very purposeful about being present and attentive.
Right.
And the Christian classical model for Wesley and myself has been a way to just take that to the next level in terms of nurturing the souls of our children and helping them learn to learn, learning ourselves alongside them, being able to model humility in learning, and educating the whole person. So I think that's about all the time we have.
Okay.
So thanks everybody for listening. Hopefully you've enjoyed this.